Podcasts are about power. Power to define and the power to decide. From protests to power gain, we welcome you to our fight for political and economic freedoms here in America. We're almost there. Welcome to this week's episode.
Hello, welcome to a SNCC Legacy Project podcast. I'm Bruce Hartford, and with me today are Mary Louise Patterson, Dottie Zellner, and Bill Minter. Given the reality of politics today, many of us have been remembering and thinking about the McCarthy era of the 1950s. In the 1950s, McCarthyism, also known as the Red Scare, was an right-wing, white supremacist political and media strategy to incite racism, fear, hatred, and hysteria against all those they labeled as un-American, subversive, liberal, and foreign-born. McCarthyism was a partisan political campaign by a coalition of segregationist Democrats who called themselves Dixiecrats and extremist anti-New Deal Republicans. The Red Scare was financed and promoted by wealthy individuals who Franklin Roosevelt referred to as plutocrats, also Southern plantation owners, large anti-union corporations with global financial interests, and major elements of mass media, such as the Chicago Tribune and its McCormick media conglomerate, which was the Fox News of the 1950s. McCarthyism and its sponsors had very clear goals. First, destroying or crippling the labor and civil rights movements. Second, mandating an anti-communist foreign policy to protect colonialism around the world and oppose national liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Vietnam War, which killed 60,000 Americans and 2 million Asians, was a direct result of the Red Scare. Third goal was controlling and intimidating grade schools and colleges to compel a conservative, right-wing education and academic worldview. Fourth, shifting government spending away from domestic social programs and into military defense and police militarization. And fifth, ensuring re-election of incumbent Republicans and Dixiecrats by inciting fear and hysteria and smearing all opponents as, quote, soft on communism. Now, some of you may be thinking that this description sounds a bit like the Tea Party, a bit like MAGA, a bit like Trump. And you're right if you do so. When Obama was elected in 2008, Republicans and white nationalists began reviving the McCarthyite playbook with the Tea Party. Since 2016, Trump and his MAGA acolytes have made a new McCarthyism the center of their campaign strategy. And this is not surprising. First, because McCarthyism was very successful in crippling labor, attacking civil rights, and undermining New Deal business regulation and social programs. Second, the puppeteer behind Senator McCarthy was a ruthless political operator named Roy Cohn. Later, in the 1970s, Roy Cohn became a mentor to a young buccaneer businessman named Donald Trump, teaching him the power techniques of lies, deceit, slander, and legal evasion. So, Mary Louise, what are your thoughts and experience?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone or whoever is responsible for inviting me to be a part of this important talk. I'm really honored to be here. Well, Bruce, I was I was born to two African American activists who were members of the Communist Party very early on. You know, the Communist Party was formed in 1919, and my father, joined the party around 1928 or 29, and my mother joined around 1932, 31, 32, 33, somewhere in there. Um, and they came to communism out of their experiences as African Americans growing up in this country, basically through nationalism. They came to an international and a socialist outlook and understanding of the social and political forces in the world, and what they wanted for themselves, what they wanted for me, what they wanted for their grandchildren, and everyone else. And that was not capitalism. And actually, the Red Scare of the 1950s, as you know, was the second Red Scare. The first Red Scare being around the time of Sacco and Vanzetti and the Palmer raids earlier in the 20th century. Uh, my my experience has been was the experience that I think a lot of people are having today. Uh, there were my parents' friends, Claudia Jones, for instance, had been born in Trinidad, and she was being threatened with deportation. She was jailed under the Smith Act, and then once out of jail, she in fact was deported. Did not go back to Trinidad and wound up going to London. But the my experience was the surveillance most of all that I recall. The surveillance was relentless, and a lot of it was very open to basically alienate you from your neighbors, to incite fear of you in your neighbors, to try to have your neighbors report on you. Um, and they would sit outside in a Ford car. It was usually dark colored, dark navy, and there'd be sometimes two and sometimes four men sitting in the car, and they would just be sitting in the car right out in front of our house. And they did that often. In fact, there were times when they did it almost every single day. And I used to sometimes on my way to school or back from school, when I walked to school, I would go like this and fan my fingers at them as if they stank, because they did, uh, figuratively, of course. Um, but I'll end on that point. But that was my experience, the tremendous surveillance, and knowing that our telephones were tapped, and later when the technology improved, that cameras were put in the home, or small microphones were hidden throughout your home. And also, lastly, I'll say before I stop that um, they would routinely go through our garbage. We lived in Brooklyn, and we lived in a two-family dwelling, and we had the top two floors, and the garbage cans were around the back in the alley. And they'd routinely go through the garbage and often leave the garbage strewn out on the ground, um, looking for what, I don't know, letters, written materials. But that's what I recall.
So, Dorothy?
Yes, well, I spent my entire adolescence under the cloud of the Red Scare. My parents were foreign born. That's one of the categories that you, Bruce, mentioned. And we had a little twist because we grew up in the same tenement building with one of the leaders of the Communist Party, and our families were quite close. So a lot of things that happened to them, sort of, we felt were happening to us, like surveillance and so forth. And when the father of this family was arrested, the FBI came and banged on the door at 7 a.m. and took him away under the Smith Act. Within a month, my father had a nearly fatal heart attack. And had we not lived a block from the hospital, he probably would have died. So I want to pick up on something that Mary Louise said about the Smith Act. People don't know what this act was, and what it said was you could be liable for prosecution if you conspired to teach or advocate the violent overthrow of the government. In other words, 3 steps: you had to be in a conspiracy, and then you had to teach, and then you had to advocate. And not one of the people who were ever were charged with a gun, with a bullet, unlike the people in January 6th, of course. Now, the Red Scare is supposed to have started around 1948 or 1949, and people who don't know much about it should understand that millions of people were presented with loyalty oaths, and hundreds and thousands were dismissed from their jobs, lost their jobs. In the city of New York, there were hundreds of teachers who lost their jobs. And the fear was everywhere. The fear was everywhere. There were some people who were very brave. My parents weren't especially brave. Maybe that because they were foreign born, they thought they could be deported, like Mary Louise described. Um, we were very, very careful about talking on the phone. We understood that we were being listened to. I think in those days they didn't have the technology of photographing us, as far as I know. We knew that the police were watching us. And in fact, not the cops were watching us, it was the FBI was watching us, because my father had a local friendly neighborhood cop who warned him and said, be careful when you're filing your IRS forms. Be careful. So, and the way it was translated to us as children was that we had a separate language. I mean, if in school you said the term Soviet Union, which was the accurate term for the country that we now know as Russia, then you were marked as a red. Now, why that is so, I don't exactly know. The other thing we were ridiculously had to say was Red China. Not China, the country, but if you mentioned China, you had to say Red China. So you learned a sort of separate language, a language that you would use when you were with your friends or family, and another language when you were in school so that you wouldn't be marked as one of these terrible people. So altogether, I think it was a dreadful, dreadful time. And I wrote down a whole list of the people who were affected in getting ready for this. And it was really shocking. I mean, teachers, electoral candidates, people getting passports had to sign a loyalty oath. Um, Union officials, union workers, as Bruce said earlier, a way of destroying the unions, professional groups, and of course the entertainment industry, and I think people do know who watch AMC about the Hollywood 10 and the people who were silenced, who were supposed to be read, who were writing movies. So it altogether was an absolute terrible time, and the purpose of it was to intimidate and shut up people, and it did. Although there were people like Mary Louise's parents and other people, and I myself to a certain extent, who fought back. But it was a terrible time, and it will be another terrible time if Trump gets his way into doing this.
Bill?
I have to start out by saying that some of these descriptions are very familiar, but I grew up in Mississippi, and at least from age 4 to 14, 1946 to 1956, and the issue was communism was a communist was basically anybody who supported equality. It didn't. It wasn't their views on foreign policy. It wasn't their views on domestic policy. It was anybody who was opposed to racism was seen as possibly likely communist. Um, my parents were not members of a political party. However, we lived in an interracial cooperative in Holmes County, Mississippi, which those of you who will know Mississippi know is unique even within Mississippi for the depth of the racism. Um, and for the most part, um, as I said, I was 4 to age 14. We weren't politically active. We were just an example of a cooperative that was in practice interracial. It actually wasn't much of a farm. It was basically a medical clinic that my father ran. It was a co-op store. It was a credit union. The land had been flooded, so there wasn't much farming really, and there were educational programs, but there were both white and black who lived there, both those of us who came from outside the county, like my parents and others, and the Coxes who came from Texas, and whose commitments were could be described basically, if you put it in ideological terms, as Christian socialist. But actually, it wasn't ideology that was important to the people who attacked us. It was that it was the issue was race, and anti-communism was basically just a way of saying anti-pro equality. Um, this came to a head at a different timetable than nationally because the key precipice for it turning into open repression instead of quiet repression was the Supreme Court decision in 1954. And then when the white citizens councils began to organize. And then in 1955 came the murder of Emmett Till, 2 counties over from us. Uh, and um, and basically that meant that the climate was coming, that the white racist community was getting organized and was looking for targets. They found this interracial co-op as a target, and they decided to attack it. It wasn't attacked physically. We were fortunate, but almost all my patients, my father's patients, were black. They were told, don't go to Dr. Mentor or you get kicked off the plantation or you got fired if you were working for white people. The people who could be protected and kept coming to my father were those in the hill country who were black farmers who had owned their land uh, uh, for since slavery, actually, and held on to it and actually did some pretty good farming. Were pretty professional farmers. Um, well, things came to a head in 1955, and the white community of Chula, Mississippi, met in the consolidated school, the white elementary school, which I and my sisters obtained. They met at night, a mob of perhaps 400 to 500. And my father and Gene Cox, who were the two white professionals on the farm, were called at a moment's notice to come in and stand trial. It ended up in a unanimous vote, almost unanimous vote. There were 2 or 3 dissenters um, voting that people on Providence Farm were not welcome in Holmes County. Now, we held on after that, but we the farm didn't survive, the cooperative didn't survive. My father lost his medical license. His patients were much reduced by the fact that it was really taking a risk. Although one patient uh, who lived up in the hill country, actually, we were sticking it out for a year. Economically, it was difficult. I mean, as my father had also lost his medical license, insurance, not his MD, obviously, but the what happened. One patient, down the road from our hill country, down into the down. It was a dirt road. The bottom of the road, the sheriff had set up patrols, allegedly to protect us, and actually to intimidate us, and to intimidate any people who wanted to come and see us, or to come by there to go to the clinic where my father was. Uh, so one story that I heard from my parents, I wasn't at an age to notice and remember these things really, is that just a month or two before we actually left, we decided to move. We moved to Arizona. The other white family, professional family, moved to Memphis and became organizers for the National Council of Churches on Racism. But this one patient brought his shotgun and came up to my father and said, I know you're going to have to leave, and I know I owe you $6 on my medical bill. You might need some traveling money. So he handed my father the unpaid $6, which had been the cost of his medical bill.
Okay, thank you. Both of my parents were union organizers in the 1930s and 40s. The American Communications Association union that they devoted 2 decades of their lives to building was destroyed by McCarthyism, and my parents were blacklisted. For years, our family was hounded and persecuted by the FBI and by elected officials because of our support for civil and labor rights. When I was 6, the Altadena suburb where we were living passed a law that being a quote subversive unquote made you an unfit parent, and your children could be taken away and placed in foster care. So we had to quickly relocate to central Los Angeles where that law did not apply. So our new home was the site of my very first political action and my very first civil disobedience. I was 9 or 10 when I had to block 2 FBI agents from entering our home to seize Ethel Shapiro and Angelo Bertolini, who were hiding in our basement to avoid deportation under one of the many Red Scare anti subversive laws. Back then, and maybe still today, it was a felony to lie to an FBI agent. But if my parents had answered the door and admitted that they were harboring a fugitive, that was also a felony. And if they refused to answer at all, that could be construed as probable cause for an immediate search. At that time, though, FBI agents were not allowed to interrogate children without a parent present, at least not white children. So while my mom and dad waited just out of sight, I was sent to answer the door and tell the FBI agents that they could not enter our home and no one inside wanted to talk to them. Now, years later, as a teenager, I really enjoyed defying adults. But at that age, the agents were intimidating and standing against them was scary, even though I knew my parents were listening just out of sight. And these weren't ordinary adults. They were FBI, who the TV told me were the heroic defenders of truth, justice, and the American way, like Superman. So when they tried to bully and intimidate me into allowing them entry, I just hung my head and stubbornly repeated that they could not come in and no one wanted to talk to them. Eventually, they left, and Ethel and Angelo were whisked away to some new safe house. I didn't see them again for years until the Supreme Court overturned that particular law. Of course, the majority of justices on that court had been appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. Today's court is quite different. Mary Louise, what continued thoughts do you have?
I'd like to pick up on some of the points that Dottie made. Um, that period was a period of tremendous fear that was promoted all over the country. Television had just come in the late 1940s, and a lot of people had, I guess, at that time had TVs. We didn't have a TV, but there were many people who did have a TV. And the the hearings, the Un-American Activity Committee hearings, that the subcommittee hearings that were conducted by McCarthy were really scary, and they were broadcast nationally. And this created a tremendous pall over the country of fear. And Dottie talked about people losing their jobs. There were people who committed suicide. Um, People found out that their spouses were informing to the FBI, or that they were told their spouses were informing to the FBI. There were all kinds of tricks, and this was the government. The government was politically repressing the entire country. And as you mentioned, Bruce, the objectives were, of course, on the national front to prevent any kind of change in the status quo in the South, in the conditions of African Americans, in the conditions of farmers, to maintain capital control of the country. Um, and so as children, we were told, you didn't talk to the FBI, you didn't talk to strangers, not because they would kidnap you, but because they were FBI and they were out to get your parents. Um, and yes, uh, Bill, you're right. There was this picture of the FBI as being the champions of freedom and defending the country against foreign invaders who were going to destroy the American way of life. But in fact, they were henchmen, and they were intimidating and scaring. I had a friend who was denounced at school. The FBI went to his school here in New York City and told the principal that he was a child of Reds, and he was denounced. And no one would play with him um, at PE when we went outdoors to play. No one would play with him. The kids who played baseball, they wouldn't allow him to play baseball with them, and he was basically shunned. This is a child uh, by his peers and by the teachers, because the FBI, denounced his parents to the school administration. And these are the kinds of things that they did back then to intimidate, to get people to cower, to denounce their beliefs, um, and to basically fall in line. One of the things that I think those who were who were black and who were children of black communists, if you lived in the black community, there was less surveillance and less hounding. Um, Probably because of racism. I mean, that was kind of the silver lining, right? That even though the Black community may not have been pro-communist, they also were not necessarily pro-government, um, or not a pro-police, I should say, not pro-government, but pro-police. And so there was some level of protection, I think, for Black communists and their children that did not exist for white communists and their children. But it was that period of fear, that a communist, was under every bed, and that they were also anti-Christian. That was another one of the points that they made, is that they were anti-God, and they were for, I remember, free love, and they were going to take all the women and put them in free love camps and force them to have sex. Um, those kinds of, outrageous, ludicrous uh, ideas. The same, kind of ludicrous stuff that's being said now about immigrants coming across the border, et cetera, or the QAnon conspiracists who have the pizzeria and the killing of children and the eating of children and all of that kind of idiocy. But it was being said by the government, and the government must know what it's talking about. So people believed it, and we were taught that in schools. And just one other point I want to pick up on that Dottie talked about. There was a particular direction attack on schools and education that we're seeing again today, under the guise of critical race theory, CRT, et cetera. But back then, the understanding that public education was in fact really an enemy of um, of capitalism and of democracy. I mean that. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. That public education was one of the pillars of democracy, and that those forces that were anti-democratic were not the communists, but actually, or not the socialists, or not but were rather the people who represented the 1% and wanted to keep the status quo, wanted to keep it that way, the 1% in control.
Dorothy, your thoughts?
Yes. So to move back a little bit in time, by the time I was in high school, there were three different committees working to rout out the so-called communist menace. So one was in the House, popularly called HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. The other was a Senate committee, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. And the third was the McCarthy Committee, which did a lot of miscellaneous plus the Army. And they were running free reign. They could investigate anytime they wanted to. They didn't only stay in Washington. The Senate committee went to New Orleans in 1954 and investigated the Southern Conference Educational Fund. Um, and generally speaking, they lasted until the early 60s, when in fact the counterattack, the fight back started growing. And it was mostly a fight back of derision. The famous example is the Women's uh, SANE, which was the Women's Anti-Nuclear Organization. When they were subpoenaed, every person who sat up front was given flowers as if she were a heroine, which she was, to testify. Nevertheless, by 1963, it was still a potent force. So I want to tell you a SNCC story, since this is a SNCC Legacy Project podcast. By 1963, there were pressures on SNCC from people like Al Lowenstein about why SNCC was not conducting its own investigatory uh, processes against people who wanted to come south and work with SNCC. And at that time, SNCC resolutely did not do investigations, did not ask people, are you now or have you ever been, or do anything like that. And people like Al Lowenstein were quite unhappy about that and wanted to make sure that that could be instituted, which it was not. And Miss Baker, the great Miss Ella Baker, whom I assume people know, worked with Anne Braden, a great white freedom fighter in the South. They were very, very good friends and drinking buddies, I might say. And they worked together, and they came to SNCC, and they told SNCC that they thought it was very important to have what we then called a civil liberties uh, conference. And they asked me to run it, and which I did. And it was a weekend basically of SNCC people talking to each other about this whole issue. Do we want people to control who becomes SNCC members because they are so-called communists? And what would we do if we were subpoenaed? Because at the time, if you were subpoenaed, you had two very limited ways of dealing with this. You could do the First Amendment, which entitled you to say whatever you wanted, and you could get into trouble, depending on what you said, or you could say the Fifth Amendment, which meant you couldn't say anything. And people were reluctant to use the Fifth Amendment because that was the so-called coward's way out. The First Amendment meant you were probably going to be cited for contempt of Congress. And just bringing us up to the present day, it has driven me completely crazy to see these white right-wing people run circles around what they never thought twice about when it came to us. And some of these people never obeyed a subpoena. They never came. They needed everything. And very few of them were charged. Unlike us, there were several of us who went to prison. So back to this conference. Now, the SNCC meeting, it wasn't a conference, it was a meeting, and it has been very poorly covered. It's in the book, Hands on the Freedom Plow, was crucial because it was a very painful meeting. I remember Bob Moses really having an agonizing conversation with everybody because he felt responsible for some of the early deaths of people who registered to vote. And he was the one who had recruited them, and he felt partially responsible when they were killed. He did not want to be responsible for any local people who would be killed on the issue of a communist being in and around the community. And he was really agonized over this. And I remember many painful minutes. But in the end, the SNCC, we took a vote, and the overwhelming majority of the people there was that not only was SNCC not going to delve into people's political background, but SNCC would not testify. In other words, would be uncooperative if any government agency subpoenaed us to go to Washington and to go through this dismal dance. And I am convinced from later conversations with Julian that the likelihood of a spy being at this meeting was great because we were being infiltrated by the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation and also Sovereignty Commission. And I am convinced to this day that the word went to Washington and said, do not subpoena these people, because at the time we were the young people whom everybody was marveling at. We were the young people, the young Black people who sat down at the lunch counters and started the sit-in movement. And we were the young Black people. I use the word we inclusively. We were the ones who went to Mississippi to get people to register to vote. And this was before the summer of '64, when the three civil rights workers were killed. So I am convinced that our position was transmitted up the chain. That's why we were not investigated. And it was one more nail in the coffin of the red baiting, which did in succeeding years decline. And it was a product of courage on the part of SNCC and ridicule on the part of women's organizations and all other kind of tactics of standing up. But this is a SNCC story, and it should, for those people who are interested in SNCC, they should understand that this is one of the great things that SNCC not only did for itself, but did for everybody else.
Bill, thoughts?
Yes, my thoughts are going along a somewhat different line, not so much in terms of thinking about the attacks against us, but about our response to them. And I think I learned a lot from different people, first from my parents and then from SNCC, and when I was there in Southwest Georgia, and then from the Mozambique Liberation Front in Tanzania and Mozambique, that the enemy will always be trying to divide you and divide you from the people you're trying to mobilize. And they will use all kinds of demonization, and they will also use provocateurs and lies and infiltration to set people against each other. The only answer to that is what I was told once by Joaquin Chissano of Mozambique: never believe rumors, because they're almost always started by somebody with a motive, and that basically the Frelimo position, the SNCC position, was bring people in, don't alienate them, and deal with people where they are. Um, Whatever their ideology, whatever their race, whatever their gender or nationality, and build uh, alliances and networks along the lines of integrity and justice. And that's what you can use to counter the lies. Um, it doesn't always work, of course, because sometimes we can get deceived as well, and be turned against us. And the amount of factionalism within many leftist organizations over the years, both internally produced by people's egos, and produced by outside intervention, is enormous. But we have to take a stance that we're building a larger and larger network, winning over the people we can win over, and even winning over some of the enemies when one can.
You know, one of the things I learned about the Red Scare and McCarthyism and Trumpism is that hate terms, smears like subversion, communism, wokeism, they can mean whatever they want it to mean in order to attack and destroy those they see as their enemy. One time, I was working on the voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama. Jim Clark, the notorious sheriff, arrested me on some trumped up charge. And as he was shoving me into his police car, he called me a communist. Now, being young, brash, and stupid, I retorted, "Communist? What's a communist?" Clark wasn't stumped at all. He knew the answer right off. A communist is any goddamn New York kike what wants our niggers to vote. Well, except for the fact that I was from LA, he had me dead to rights. For him, and for most white Southerners at that time, any challenge to or any effort to change the Jim Crow Southern way of life was for them the ultimate evil. In other words, communism. As Bill and Mary Louise said, after the Brown decision in 1954, the Dixiecrat white power structure in the South launched an all-out campaign, particularly to destroy the NAACP, SNCC not having been invented yet. A whole raft of new laws targeting subversive organizations were enacted across the South. These laws empowered the state attorney general to designate organizations as, quote, subversive without due process or appeal. So the NAA was immediately classified and publicly vilified as a subversive organization. Based on that, the law then allowed the legal system to target and attack the NAACP in the South and to persecute its members. Meanwhile, the White Citizens Council, which was organized immediately after the Brown decision, inflicted economic terrorism against individual NAACP members, and the Ku Klux Klan was encouraged to physically assault, bomb, and assassinate NAACP members with impunity. All of that was publicly justified by the patriotic Red Scare rhetoric. Now, these various anti-subversion laws, the economic terrorism by the white citizens' councils, and the violent terrorism by the Ku Klux Klan were very effective. In Louisiana, for example, at the time of the Brown decision, the NAACP had 13,000 dues-paying members in 65 branches across the state. 3 years later, they were down from 13,000 to just 1,700 in 7 branches, all of which were in New Orleans. The NAACP had been eliminated as an organization in the entire rest of the state for years until it could recover. Now, of course, the NAACP members were still there, and many, particularly those who owned their own business or land, held fast to their membership and fought on as best they could. In some places, they were able to form new organizations with benign sounding non racial names, such as Bogalusa Voters and Civic League. But valuable and courageous as those local groups were, they were isolated from the kinds of support that affiliation with a national organization had previously provided. So I think we still have some more time. So Mary Louise, further thoughts?
Um, Going back to the 1950s, 1948, post World War II, um, the Red Scare also was happening at a time when national liberation, and anti-colonial movements were gearing up, coming out of World War II. Fascism had been smashed at the moment, and liberation struggles, people fighting for freedom and their own liberation, their national liberation. These struggles were gearing up, and the Soviet Union was supportive of those efforts, and the capitalist countries were the colonial countries. So clearly, they were not supportive of those efforts. And so, I think the larger context for that Red Scare period, the 1950s, is this anti-colonial, um, anti-imperialist surge within the world, and in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And there was the that was on the international stage, and on the national stage you had the struggle, the surge of within the Black liberation, the civil rights movement. Um, and so that was, I think, the political and the economic underpinnings of that period. And clearly, um, white people who uh, who sided with those who were fighting colonialism, or those who were fighting racism at home, were enemies of the state, as were the Black people and the others people, Latinos and Native Americans, Filipinos, Asian Americans. Um, they were enemies of the state because they were enemies of the status quo. And the status quo was what was considered democracy. Capitalism was equated with democracy. um, the way that we're seeing some people saying that, if you are anti-Zionist, then you're anti-Semitic. Well, if you were anti-capitalist, you were then anti-democratic or anti-democracy. And, in my own family, two examples. My father um, was the head of the organization at that time called the Civil Rights Congress, and they had been formed coming out of the 1940s to represent victims of racism and racist violence. Um, but they also represented a number of Smith Act victims as well. And so this organization was targeted by the government. Um, and my father, who was the head of the organization, um, was subpoenaed to show up in Washington, and he was ordered to turn over the names of the funders and the donors of the organization. Um, People like Dashiell Hammett, who was at that time a very well-known mystery detective book writer, and the partner of Lillian Hellman, was on the was a part of the CRC. And my father refused to hand over the names, and so he was held in contempt of Congress. The head of the committee that he was appearing before was a congressman out of Georgia, Lanham. And my dad had excellent oratory skills, and he was also a really good debater. And he goaded Lanham, um, telling Lanham that, asking how many Negroes had he lynched, how many had been lynched in Georgia. And Lanham calls my dad um, a goddamn black son of a bitch, and jumps up out of his seat and comes around the table. He breaks through two of the Capitol guards. He's charging at my father, and he's stopped by, well, no, I'm sorry, the Capitol Police stopped him. He brushed past the guards who were in the Congress chamber, and little did he know that my father had boxed his way through through law school, and he was an excellent boxer. And he was just waiting for Lanham to get close enough to deck him. My dad was stripped of his passport and um, didn't get it back until 1959. The same with Du Bois and W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who were also stripped of their passports, as were many others. And then the story about my mother is that she started an organization because of what happened to Du Bois and Robeson and their hounding and Du Bois is being charged with uh, being an alien sympathizer. So he loses his passport, and so does Robeson, and they can't find work. Robeson can't sing anymore, um, and he's vilified. And my mother and a number of other women, but it was primarily my mother and Bea Richards, who stayed up all night. They came up with this idea of creating an organization called the Sojourners for Peace and Justice, and that these would be women who were primarily Black women who were fighting for uh, the against the government's repression and hounding and terrorizing of Robeson and Du Bois and other Black men, my father, Alpheus Hunton, etc. And so this organization organized overnight. They wrote this call to Black women to show up in Washington D.C. And within several weeks, they mobilized um, a group of 20 some odd women from all over, Black women from all over the country, including Eslanda Robeson, Paul Robeson's wife, Dorothy Hunton, who was Alpheus Hunton's wife, um, Bea Richards, Alice Childress, who was a famous writer and playwright, and many others who came to Washington. And they went to tried to see the president, went to Congress, and also went to the Pentagon. And at the Pentagon, they had with them a one of these wind-up dolls that was a caricature of Black people with big red lips and a watermelon in his hand. And when you wound this doll up, it kind of danced a jig. And they had this doll, and they were able to see one of the lower echelon people within the Pentagon. And this doll was a doll that the Pentagon um, had on the bases overseas. And so they wound the doll up and put it on this guy's desk, and the doll is dancing the jig. And they're saying, this is what you're showing people, internationally. This is the image of Black people that you're promoting. This is a caricaturized image. This is a racist image. They didn't get to see the president, of course, but it was a tremendous effort, and they got a lot of news, a lot of press, and they were hounded out of existence, as was the CRC. To go to Dottie's point, the government would often use the IRS to attack organizations that it wanted to shut down. And that's what happened with both of those organizations.
What a wonderful story, Mary Louise. On behalf of the SNCC Legacy Project, I'd like to thank Mary Louise Patterson, Dottie Zellner, Bill Minter, and the crew who are recording this for allowing us to be on this podcast to talk about McCarthyism and how it affected us and society. And I want to thank viewers for watching the SNCC Legacy Project podcast series, of which this is just one. Thank you and goodbye.
For full biographies, additional resources, and B-roll clips, visit our website at www.snclegacyproject.org.